Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. You are listening to The Voice of Reason. And on today's episode, I wanted to touch on a topic that a lot of people on TikTok have been asking me about, and that has to do with the date of Easter. People are saying that we celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December every single year, but why does the date of Easter always change? This is something that I actually really like discussing and talking about, because it also leads into things that I find interesting, such as the calendars of the church. And also I want to talk about why there is a difference of a week between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches in the celebration of Easter. So let us begin. It's important to understand that the difference in the dates of the celebration of Easter actually goes back to the very beginning of the church. What a lot of people don't know is that the apostles themselves actually commemorated the yearly celebration of the new Passover on different dates. It appears that of the 12 apostles, and 13 if you count the apostle Paul, not all of them actually observed the same Jewish calendars. What a lot of people don't know is that even the Jews themselves had different calendars in which they celebrated the Jewish feasts. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees had different calendars, and the apostles themselves, depending on which group of Jews that they were evangelizing or who they were writing to in their writings, they would actually appeal to the different calendars of the different Jewish groups that were being written to. And really there was only two different calendars amongst the Jewish community. This is why some people mistakenly believe that there is a contradiction in the Gospels, because the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say that Jesus was crucified on the Passover day, but the Gospel according to John says that the day before, Holy Thursday, the day of the Last Supper, was the Passover day itself. So people mistakenly believe that this is an error or a contradiction, but it's actually not true. It turns out that the Jews in the time of Jesus actually held two different liturgical calendars. And when you actually look back at the years in which Jesus lived, you can see that in the year 30 AD and in the year 33 AD, the Passover fell on a Friday, both of those years, but the Sadducees actually observed the Passover the next day, which was the Sabbath day. So in the early church, there was a difference between the Christians in the West that celebrated Easter on one day and the Christians in the East that celebrated Easter on a different day. The Christians in the West would always celebrate Easter on a Sunday, and the Christians in the East would actually always celebrate Easter on the 14th of Nisan, which is the date of the Passover for the Jews. And there was actually a controversy in the 2nd century where the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was actually going to excommunicate all of the Christians in the East because they refused to celebrate the new Passover, what we now call Easter in the English-speaking world. These Christians were celebrating the Passover on whichever day the 14th of Nisan fell on, and the Pope thought that the universal church should all celebrate Easter together. So the Pope was going to excommunicate the Eastern Christians, but it was actually, I believe, St. Irenaeus that talked to the Pope and said, hey, no, don't excommunicate them. Just let them continue on with their traditions, because they were taught by the apostles who used that calendar. And it actually wasn't until the 4th century when all of the Christians universally agreed upon a fixed day to celebrate the date of Easter. And that leads us to the discussion on the calendars that were being used by the church. You see, the Christians for the first 4 centuries were using the different Jewish calendars depending on if they were Western Christians or Eastern Christians. And it was at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in the year 325 when all of the bishops of the world got together and they decided on when the Easter should be celebrated universally. And the formula that they gave us at the Council of Nicaea is the same formula that all Christians use to this day. And the formula is this: Easter will always fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon, that is after or on the first day of spring, or what is known as the spring equinox. So the first day of spring, the first full moon, which is either on that day or whenever it happens after that day, and Easter will always be on the immediate Sunday after that first full moon happens. So what that means is that Easter can be as early as March 22nd or as late as April 25th. Easter will always fall within that time period, March 22nd and April 25th. So this is the formula that all Christians, East and West, use so that they could all universally celebrate Easter on the same day. But because the Christians of the East and the West use different Jewish calendars, at the Council of Nicaea, they decided that they would actually use the secular calendar, that is the Roman calendar, to start commemorating all of their feast days. So the Jewish calendar is based off of lunar days, and the Roman calendar, which is the calendar that we pretty much use in 99% of the world, is a solar calendar based off of solar days. And the science of putting together a calendar has to do with calculating the exact precise amount of time that it takes for planet Earth to do one full rotation around the sun. We know now that it's about 365 days, and more precisely 365.2422 days. So all calendars in history have tried to pinpoint this exact time and make the calendar according to that time frame. And the reason that it's important for the calendar to be precise is because they need to know when the seasons happen, because they need to know when to plant in order to have harvests. So the entire point of calendars is to know when the harvest will happen, and so that all of the people can be on the same page or the same calendar, so to speak, in knowing when to commemorate what needs to be commemorated. Calendars are very useful tools for this. Jonathan. So the very first Roman calendar actually was put together in the 8th century BC. And that calendar consisted of 10 months and about 304 days. Those 10 months were the months of March, April, May, June, Quintilis, Sextilis, September, October, November, and December. So those 10 months totaled up to 304 days, meaning that they still had about 61 days left over. So that calendar wasn't very accurate, which is why after a few years it was changed and it was modified. It added 2 more months. After December, it added the months of January and February, and then every 2 or 3 years they would have to add a 13th month for the leap year. And every time that there would be a leap year, the year would have about 370 days. That calendar was a lot more precise than the previous calendar that only had 304 days. And even though the second calendar was a lot more precise, it still had a shortfall of about 11 days. And year by year, those 11 days would eventually add up and it would start shifting the seasons, which again is no good because you need to be exact so that you know when the harvest would happen. So the next change in the Roman calendar happened in about the year 45 BC with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar updated the Roman calendar and it became known as the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar actually shortened all of the months and it got rid of the 13th month that would be added every 2 to 3 years. By shortening the days in each month, they no longer had to have that extra 13th month, and all they had to do was every few years add 1 or 2 days on a leap year to keep the calendar adjusted. So this new Julian calendar was promulgated across the entire Roman Empire by Caesar Augustus, just a few years before the birth of Christ. This Julian calendar had the 12 months that we have now, and it was March, April, May, and June. By the way, those 4 months are named after the pagan Roman gods. But Augustus replaced the month of Quintilis with July in honor of Julius Caesar, and the month of Sextilis with August in honor of himself. And then we had September, October, November, December, January, and February. So this is the 12-month calendar with a few days added every leap year to keep the calendar in line with the 4 seasons. Now, this calendar was the most accurate solar calendar that had ever been put together. It was so accurate, it only had a shortfall of about 11 minutes. The previous calendar had a shortfall of 11 days. Now, 11 minutes doesn't seem like it makes much of a difference, but year after year, decade after decade, century after century, it would eventually make a big difference and the calendar would then have to be adjusted again. It wasn't until the 16th century that this calendar finally had to be adjusted. In the 1500s is when all of the people started noticing that the calendar was no longer in sync with the season. Those 11 minutes Those 11 minutes had added up and made a significant noticeable difference to the people. So in the year 1582, it was the Pope, Pope Gregory XIII, who promulgated a change in the Julian calendar. Now, the Julian calendar actually remained the same. The only difference is that they started calculating and adding up the leap years in different ways. This simple change in handling leap years led to what is now known as the Gregorian calendar, which is the most accurate solar calendar that we use to this day. It is so accurate that the shortfall of the Julian calendar was about 11 minutes, and the shortfall of the current calendar that we have is 27 seconds. We are 27 seconds away from having a perfect calendar, and it's the calendar that we still use to this very day. By the way, the geniuses that put together this calendar were Catholic monks. The calendar that we use in 99% of the world was put together by Catholic monks and promulgated by the Pope. It was the Catholic monks back in the Middle Ages in the 16th century that were able to put together a calendar that would only give us a shortfall of 27 seconds every single year. Geniuses. But now here's where it gets really interesting. When the changes were made to the Julian calendar, in order to transition to the new and improved Gregorian calendar, what was going to have to happen is that they were going to have to move the date up 10 days. And this happened in the year 1582 in the month of October. On October 4th, 1582, everybody in Western Europe went to bed. And when they woke up the next morning, it was October 15th, 1582. They had to move up 10 days in order to make the appropriate adjustments to implement the new Gregorian calendar. But here is the problem. Because it was the Catholic Pope that implemented this calendar in Western Europe, the Christians of Eastern Europe did not want to follow suit. They didn't want to make it seem like the Eastern churches were following the Pope of Rome, so they just ignored it. So in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, they had different calendars with a 10-day difference. Now, this difference wasn't just between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Remember that at this time, there were a lot of Protestants in Western Europe as well. And guess what? Just like the Eastern Orthodox didn't want to accept the new calendar because it came from the Catholic Pope, the Protestants didn't want to accept the new calendar because it came from the Catholic Pope. So the Protestant states in Western Europe rejected the Gregorian calendar and maintained the Julian calendar. So now Western Europe was divided and they used two different calendars, the brand new and much more accurate Gregorian calendar that the Catholics used, and the outdated, no pun intended, Julian calendar that the Protestants maintained, just because they didn't want to look like they were following the Pope of Rome either. But what this then led to was a huge problem with, again, the months. Because the whole reason that the Catholic Church switched to the Gregorian calendar is because they could notice the difference in the seasons and it was messing with the date of Easter. The Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox as well had no choice but to eventually switch to the Gregorian calendar as well. With every passing year and with every passing decade, it was becoming more and more of an issue. So eventually, everyone had to switch to the Gregorian calendar. So the Catholic Church was right. But anyway, but this now takes us back to what I had mentioned before about the formula that was given to the Christian Church at the Council of Nicaea. That is that the date of Easter would always fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. So the Protestants switched over to the Gregorian calendar, not just secularly, not just civilly, but also liturgically. So that's why Catholics and Protestants celebrate Easter on the same day. But there's still a difference of a week between the Western Christians and the Eastern Christians. And that is because when Eastern Europe and everything to the east of that switched over to the Gregorian calendar, they only switched over to that calendar for civic life, civilly. The church in Eastern Europe actually maintained the Julian calendar liturgically. So like I just explained, in Western Europe in October of 1582, they had to bump up the date 10 days. Now eventually, the rest of the world adopted the Gregorian calendar, but liturgically, the Eastern churches maintain the Julian calendar, and that 10-day difference is reflected in it. So now, when they calculate the date of Easter on the Gregorian calendar versus the Julian calendar that the Eastern Orthodox still use, there is a difference of 1 week. That is why the Catholic Church celebrates Easter on one Sunday, and the Eastern Orthodox Church will celebrate it the following Sunday, because they are still using the Julian calendar for the liturgical feast. So there was a controversy over the date of Easter in the early church that was solved in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea, but then when the calendars had to change, it resulted in now a new controversy over the date of Easter between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And the reason that this difference exists is really because the Eastern Church didn't want to follow something that was promulgated by the Pope of Rome. So that is how the date of Easter is calculated. Remember that it is always on the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring. The difference between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in the dates of celebrating Easter is because the Catholic Church uses the Gregorian calendar liturgically, and the Eastern Orthodox Church still uses the Julian calendar liturgically. And now you know how the science of calendars works, and I hope that you really enjoyed this video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Share this with everyone you know so that they can learn about what I think is really interesting, because I'm a nerd. But again, leave your comments down below, like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. God bless you all.